My father humiliated my daughter, so I ended him, not how you think. Before we begin the story, take a moment to support us by liking, sharing, and subscribing. Your support means the world to our channel and helps us spread more shocking true stories to light. Now, let's get started. I always knew my father was selfish. But this was something else entirely. Amanda had been counting down the days to her 10th birthday. Her excitement bubbling over for weeks. She had a list of things she dreamed of, maybe a shiny new bike, some art supplies, or even a dollhouse. Emily and I had planned everything down to the last detail: balloons, streamers, a beautiful cake, and a house full of family and friends. And then my parents arrived. Late, of course. My father strolled in with his usual air of self-importance, my mother trailing a few steps behind. He wasn't carrying a gift bag, no neatly wrapped box, nothing that resembled a present. Instead, he held a rough, slightly broken branch in his hand. A stick. Amanda frowned, confused. "What's that?" My father extended it toward her. "Your birthday present," he announced with a smug grin. Silence. For a brief moment, the entire room stood still. Then, a few uncomfortable chuckles rippled through the guests. My sister Laura and her husband exchanged amused glances. My mother let out a forced little laugh. Amanda hesitated before reaching for it, holding the stick gingerly, like it might bite her. I don't understand." My father clapped his hands together, his grin widening. "Expensive presents are only for other grandchildren." And then he laughed, a deep, hearty laugh, as if he had just delivered the punchline to the greatest joke of his life. Laura giggled, her husband smirked, even some of our guests, the ones who didn't quite grasp what was happening, chuckled along politely. But Amanda? Her face fell. She turned to me and Emily, her voice small, uncertain. "Why is Grandpa saying that?" Emily immediately pulled her close, rubbing gentle circles on her back. I could see her jaw clench. She was holding back. I wasn't. I turned to my father, my voice low and sharp. "What the hell is wrong with you?" He shrugged, utterly unfazed. "You don't deserve my respect. William, you know that, so why should I spend money on your daughter?" The laughter died instantly. A few guests shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing they had laughed at something that wasn't funny at all. And that's when I saw red. Years of his petty games, his favoritism, his endless manipulation, it all crashed down on me at that moment. But instead of exploding, I did something else. I smiled. Then, I stood up, crossed the room, and did something that made my father's face finally fall. For the first time that night, he wasn't grinning anymore, a silence that spoke volumes. I picked up a knife. For a second, the room held its breath. Not in a violent way. I wasn't about to do anything reckless. But in a way that made it clear something was about to happen. A shift, a moment no one would forget. I turned to Amanda's cake, the one she had been so excited about, and carefully cut 2 perfect slices. One for her, one for Emily. Then, I lifted my head and looked my father dead in the eyes. "You are no longer welcome here." Silence. Not the awkward kind, not the polite, uncomfortable kind. A deep, unsettling silence. The kind that settles into the walls. That makes the air feel heavier. The kind that makes everyone realize something has changed permanently. No one moved. No one spoke. My father's smirk flickered. Just for a second, my mother stared down at her lap, avoiding my gaze. Laura, for once, didn't have a sarcastic remark ready. Even the guests, who had been so quick to laugh moments ago, suddenly didn't know whose side they were supposed to be on. Amanda sat between Emily and me, picking at her cake with small, shaky bites. She wasn't crying, but she wasn't smiling either. And that, more than anything, broke me. Finally, my father leaned back, scoffing like I was the ridiculous one. "Are you serious, William? Over a joke?" I kept my voice calm. "Steady. You humiliated my daughter on her birthday. In front of everyone. That wasn't a joke." He rolled his eyes. "Oh, please, she's 10. She'll forget about it in a week." Amanda looked up. "No, I won't." For the first time, something in my father's expression wavered. Just for a second, a flicker of doubt, but then, just as quickly, it was gone. He let out a bitter laugh and shook his head. "Jesus, this family has gone soft." That was it, the last straw. I stood up. "Get out." He snorted. "You're kicking me out? Your own father? Because I didn't spend money on your brat?" Emily stood too. Her voice was firm, unwavering. "Yes, leave, now." The tension in the room was unbearable. My mother finally raised her head, her lips pressed together, looking between us. It seemed like she wanted to say something, But she didn't. Laura scoffed. "Oh, come on. Dad was just—" I cut her off. "Just what? Just being cruel? Just making sure Amanda knows she doesn't matter to him? That's okay to you?" She shrugged. "Maybe if you weren't so." I didn't let her finish. "You know what? Let's stop pretending. Let's just be honest for once." I turned to my father. "You never respected me, and that's fine. You've always favored Laura and her kids. Fine, but I will not let Amanda grow up feeling like she is less than them. That stops today." My father shook his head and pushed his chair back. "Unbelievable. The victim complex on you." I took a step closer. My voice was cold, controlled. "Victim complex? You walked into my daughter's birthday party and handed her a broken stick while laughing about how only Laura's kids get real gifts. That's not a joke. That's you being a bitter, selfish old man." And for the first time, he had no comeback. He just stood there, jaw tight, fists clenched. I turned to my mother. "And you? Are you just going to sit there and let him do this?" She hesitated. Then, in a voice quieter than I expected, she said, "I didn't know he was going to do that." The room shifted again. My father's head snapped toward her, his eyes narrowing. "Excuse me?" She cleared her throat and straightened in her seat. "I knew you favored Laura's children, but I didn't know it would go this far." For the first time in his life, my father looked genuinely caught off guard. "Oh, don't start," he muttered. But she wasn't finished. "William's right," she said, her voice firmer now. "It wasn't a joke. It was cruel." Laura's mouth dropped open. "Mom?" She sighed, slow and tired. Then she looked at my father. "We should go." My father let out a hollow laugh. "You're actually on his side?" She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. Instead, she reached for her purse, avoiding his gaze. For the first time in my life, I saw my father speechless. And that was only the beginning. The moment everything changed, I didn't give my father time to argue. "Both of you, get out, now." My mother didn't resist. She hesitated for only a moment, then stood, casting Amanda one last glance, something almost apologetic in her eyes, before heading for the door. But my father? He lingered. He looked around the room, scanning the faces of our guests, as if waiting for someone to come to his defense. Waiting for Laura, for my mother, for anyone to stand up and tell him he was right. No one did. His face twisted in disgust. "You're a joke, William," he spat. "A weak little." "Out," I said again. My voice was calm, cold. He let out a dry, humorless laugh, shaking his head. "Fine, but don't come crawling back when you realize you can't cut me out of your life." I opened the door for him without another word. My mother stepped out first. He followed, but just before crossing the threshold, he turned to Laura. "Are you coming?" Laura hesitated. She looked at me, at Emily, at Amanda, who was still clutching the stupid stick like she didn't know what to do with it. For a brief second, I thought she might stay. Then she sighed, got up, and grabbed her husband's arm. "Yeah, I'm coming." Of course she was. The door shut behind them. For a few seconds, no one moved. The guests were frozen, waiting for some kind of cue as to what to do next. But there was nothing to say, nothing to do. And then, Amanda broke down. She buried her face into Emily's stomach, her small body shaking with quiet sobs. Emily knelt, whispering softly, rubbing her back. I crouched beside them, placing a hand on Amanda's shoulder. "Honey," I said gently, "it's okay." She lifted her head, her face streaked with tears. "Why does Grandpa hate me?" Emily closed her eyes, inhaling deeply. I clenched my fists, forcing my voice to stay steady. "He doesn't hate you," I said carefully. "He just doesn't know how to be a good person." She sniffled. "But he's nice to Laura's kids." I swallowed the lump in my throat. "I know, sweetheart, and it's not fair. But listen to me, we love you. More than anything, you don't need him to be happy." She wiped her nose on her sleeve, her voice still wobbly. "But my party is ruined." That part hurt the most. Because she was right. The air in the room was heavy. No one was laughing. No one was celebrating. Guests shuffled awkwardly, murmuring quick excuses to leave. The birthday party that was supposed to be perfect had turned into a disaster. Emily and I did our best to salvage it, to lighten the mood, but the damage was already done. The candles had melted. The presents felt meaningless. Amanda tried to smile, tried to pretend she was okay. But she wasn't. And that's when I made a decision. This wasn't over. I wasn't going to let my father walk away from this thinking he had won. Thinking he could humiliate my daughter and get away with it. No, I was going to make him regret it. He wanted to play cruel games? Fine, I'd play too, but I'd play smarter. And he wouldn't see it coming until it was too late. The beginning of the end. My father had always loved control. He built his entire life around it, controlling my mother, manipulating my sister, and, most of all, trying to control me. But there was one thing he could never control. No matter how hard he tried. My business. I built it from the ground up. Long hours, endless sacrifices, pushing through every setback, and when it finally took off, he had the audacity to act like he had something to do with it. He never invested a dime, never gave me advice, never lifted a single damn finger to help. But the moment it became successful, suddenly, he was walking around like he was a co-founder. He introduced me to people as if I worked under him. He called it our business, even though he had absolutely nothing to do with it. And the worst part? For years, I let him. I let him because deep down, I thought maybe, just maybe, if I made him feel important, he'd finally respect me. That was a mistake. After Amanda's birthday, I stopped letting things slide. The very next morning, I called my lawyer, cut him out completely. I said, a pause. Then my lawyer's voice, careful, are you sure? Your father isn't technically listed anywhere, but he's acting as a. He's nothing. I interrupted, make it official. And just like that, I closed the door on him. Forever. At first, he didn't notice. He was too busy sulking, probably expecting me to come crawling back with an apology. But when his usual calls to my office went unanswered, when his name was quietly removed from everything he had once pretended to be a part of, he finally began to realize something was wrong. Then the storm hit. He showed up at my office unannounced, brushing past my assistant like he owned the place. William, he barked. What the hell is going on? I leaned back in my chair, completely calm. I don't know what you're talking about. His face was already red with anger. I called the bank today. They won't give me any information. I called your board of directors, suddenly. I'm not welcome at their meetings. What the hell are you playing at? I shrugged. You said I didn't deserve your respect. So why should you have any part of my business? His jaw clenched. I built this with you. I laughed. No, I built this. You just like to pretend you did. His face darkened. You ungrateful little. Careful, I warned. You're in my building, and I don't owe you anything. For the first time in his life, my father looked lost. I could see it in his eyes, the way he was struggling to grasp what was happening. For years, he had walked around like a king, chest puffed out, telling everyone about his company, his influence. And now? It was gone. And the best part? He had done it to himself. He stepped closer, as if trying to regain control. You really think you can just cut me out? I smiled. I already have. His breathing was heavy now. His hands clenched into fists. I could see the rage simmering under the surface, barely contained. You'll regret this, he finally said, voice shaking. You need me. I shook my head. No, Dad, I never did. And then I pressed the button on my desk. The door opened, and two security guards stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered men who made my father look small in comparison. His face twisted in fury. Are you serious? I tilted my head. You think you can just barge in here and make demands? This isn't your house. This isn't your business. You have no authority here. And you never did. His hands curled into fists at his sides. His pride was unraveling, his ego crumbling right in front of me. You think you're untouchable? He muttered, more to himself than to me. Then, with a sneer, he leaned in. But let me remind you, son, I'm still your father. You don't just get to erase me. I smiled. I already did. The guards stepped forward. For a second, I thought he was going to fight back. His chest puffed out, his fists clenched. But then something unexpected happened. The office door opened again, and my mother walked in. The moment my mother took a stand. She wasn't supposed to be here. I hadn't spoken to her since the party, and I certainly hadn't invited her. But there she was, standing in the doorway of my office, her gaze shifting between me and my father. And on her face, a look I couldn't quite place. Howard, she said quietly, addressing my father, come with me. His anger flickered, replaced momentarily by confusion. What are you doing here? She took a slow breath, then looked at me. William, she said, her voice careful. Can we talk? Alone? I hesitated, glancing at my father. He was watching her warily, his face twisted in irritation. I turned to the guards. Give us the room. They nodded and stepped out, closing the door behind them. Now, it was just the three of us. My mother, my father, and me. Mom, I started, but she raised a hand. I know you're angry, she said, and I don't blame you. What your father did was wrong. I should have stopped him a long time ago. My father's head snapped toward her. "Barbara, what the hell?" She ignored him. "But you need to listen to me," she continued, her eyes on me now. "This isn't just about you. This is about me, too." I crossed my arms. "Go ahead." She hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said something I never expected. "I want out." I blinked. "Out of what?" She swallowed hard. "This. Him. The life I've been trapped in for decades." My father paled. The anger drained from his face, replaced by something that almost resembled fear. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his voice suddenly hoarse. She turned to him, and for the first time in my life, I saw pity in her eyes. "Howard," she said quietly, "I've spent my entire life keeping quiet, watching you play favorites, watching you tear William down because you can't stand that he's better than you." His mouth opened, then closed. She turned back to me. "I should have left a long time ago," she admitted, "but I was afraid. Afraid of losing the house. Afraid of starting over. Afraid of being alone." She exhaled slowly. "But I'm not afraid anymore." I stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "You're divorcing him?" She nodded. "If you'll help me." My father slammed his fist on my desk. "Are you out of your damn mind?" She flinched, but didn't back down. "No, Howard." She lifted her chin. "I think I'm finally sane." He turned to me now, his face red with fury. "This is your fault. You're poisoning her against me." I leaned back in my chair, unfazed. "No, Dad, you did that all by yourself." And for the first time in his life, my father looked powerless. The collapse of a tyrant. My father was shaking now, his fury barely contained. His hands gripped the edge of my desk like it was the only thing keeping him standing. "You're serious," he said, his voice quieter now, almost disbelieving. "You're really leaving me?" My mother nodded. "Yes, Howard, I am." His breathing was uneven. "You're making a mistake," he hissed. "You think he'll take care of you? You think William will save you?" He let out a bitter laugh. "Newsflash, Barbara, you walk out on me. You get nothing." I tilted my head. "Are you sure about that?" His sneer faltered. "What?" I leaned forward, my fingers tapping lightly against the desk. "You never handled the finances. Dad, you never bothered to. You just barked orders and assumed everything was under your control." His eyes darted to my mother now. "Barbara." She met his gaze, and for the first time, I saw something in her expression I had never seen before when she looked at him. Indifference. "I already spoke to the lawyers," she said calmly. "Everything in my name is mine. Half the house, half the savings, and considering how much I've put up with over the years." She straightened. "I'm going after more." My father's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I smiled. "Oh, and since you loved pretending my business was our business, I had my legal team do some digging." His breath caught. "You took out loans in your name," I continued, my voice light, almost amused, "assuming I'd cover them with company funds." His face turned a sickly shade of pale. "Guess what happens when those loans don't get paid?" I leaned back, watching the horror slowly dawn on him. "The bank doesn't come after me. They come after you." He stared at me, finally realizing just how deep he had sunk. "You're lying," he muttered. I smirked. "Find out for yourself." He turned to my mother now, desperation creeping into his voice. "Barbara, you can't do this to me." She looked at him, and for the first time, there was no hesitation, no fear, no doubt. "You did this to yourself, Howard." He stumbled back a step, gripping the desk as if he needed it to stay upright. His mouth twisted, his fists clenched, his whole body trembled with rage. "You ungrateful little—" I cut him off. "No, Dad." My voice was firm, final. "That's who you are." I stood up now, looking him dead in the eyes. "You were given a family. And instead of loving us, you played favorites. You had a son who built something incredible. And instead of being proud, you tried to take credit. You had a wife who stood by you for years. And instead of appreciating her, you treated her like she was disposable." I shook my head. "You lost everything, Dad, and you have no one to blame but yourself." The room fell silent. For the first time, my father had nothing to say. No insults, no manipulations, no way to twist the situation in his favor. He had well and truly lost. A sharp chime from my phone broke the silence. I glanced at the screen. A text from Emily. "Amanda's feeling better. We took her out for ice cream. She's smiling again." I exhaled, the tension leaving my body. That was all that mattered. Amanda was happy, safe, untouched by my father's poison. I looked back at him one last time. "You should go." He stared at me, his expression unreadable. Maybe it was regret. Maybe it was hatred. Maybe it was just the weight of realizing he had finally run out of people to manipulate. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out. My mother lingered a moment longer, looking at me with something almost like gratitude. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" I asked. "For reminding me that I still have a choice." And then she left, too. Just like that, my father was out of my life. The aftermath and a new beginning. The door clicked shut behind them. And just like that, he was gone. For the first time in my life, I felt it. Relief. Not the temporary kind. Not the shallow, fleeting sense of winning an argument. Something deeper. Something final. I sank back into my chair, exhaling slowly. It was over. No more manipulation. No more belittling. No more walking on eggshells, waiting for the next cruel remark. The next subtle insult disguised as a joke. The weight of years, the resentment, the frustration, the helplessness I had carried for so long, lifted. And yet, even as I sat there, victorious, one thought gnawed at the edges of my mind. Would he ever change? Would he ever sit alone in some dimly lit house, staring at the walls, and wonder if maybe, just maybe, he was the reason he lost everything? I doubted it. People like my father didn't change. They didn't reflect, didn't learn. They blamed, they lashed out, they rewrote history to make themselves the victim. And I was done trying to fix him. I turned my attention back to my phone, reading Emily's text again. "Amanda's feeling better. We took her out for ice cream. She's smiling again." That was all that mattered. Her smile. Not my father's approval. Not his presence in my life. I had wasted too many years chasing after something he would never give me. Respect. Now, I was done chasing. A new chapter. That night, I got home just as Emily and Amanda walked in, still carrying the last bites of their ice cream cones. Amanda ran up to me, arms outstretched. "Daddy," she squealed, wrapping her arms around my waist. I scooped her up, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "Hey, birthday girl." She pulled back, her little brows furrowing. "Is Grandpa really never coming back?" Emily shot me a glance. I chose my words carefully. "Not unless you want him to." Amanda tilted her head, thinking, "So I get to decide?" I nodded. "You always get to decide who gets to be in your life. Sweetheart, no one, not even family, gets to treat you badly and still expect to stay." She seemed to mull it over for a moment, then gave a small, firm nod. "I don't want him to come back." I felt a lump rise in my throat. It wasn't sadness. It was pride. Because at 10 years old, my daughter had already learned a lesson I had spent decades struggling to accept. That love, real love, wasn't owed, it was earned. And my father? He had never earned it. Epilogue. A legacy of strength, not pain. In the weeks that followed, my father tried. He called. He left messages, some angry, some guilt-ridden, some downright pathetic. I ignored them all. Laura, of course, took his side. "You're being dramatic, Will," she scoffed over the phone one evening. "You can't just erase Dad from your life over one mistake." One mistake? I laughed bitterly. This wasn't one mistake, Laura. It was years of them. She groaned. "You always take things so personally." "No," I said, voice steady. "I just finally realized that I don't have to." And that was the last time I answered her calls. My mother, on the other hand, she thrived. She filed for divorce. She got more than her fair share in court. She found a little house by the beach, nothing grand, but hers. For the first time in her life, she was free. And as for Amanda, she never mentioned my father again. Not once. She didn't cry about it. Didn't bring up the birthday disaster. She simply moved on. Because when you're surrounded by love, by people who lift you up instead of tearing you down, you don't spend time mourning the ones who never deserved a place in your heart to begin with. And as I watched my daughter grow, as I saw her laugh, play, chase her dreams without the shadow of my father looming over her, I knew I had done the right thing. Breaking the cycle, choosing love over obligation, proving to Amanda, to Emily, to myself, that we were better off without him. And we always would be. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe for more real-life family dramas. Let me know in the comments what you think about today's story. Was it fair or totally messed up? See you in the next one.